Well, it is great to have Leader McConnell with us. And I would take this opportunity with his long history of public service to talk to him today about leadership. So Leader, you wrote a book called The Long Game. And I know, having had the privilege of serving in the Senate, that for many senators, their long game is running for president. Did you ever think about running for president? And when you talk about the long game, what's your long game?
Well, actually, I didn't. Unlike most senators, I didn't look in the mirror every morning and view the face of a future president. I did, however, want to have a long career in the Senate. And John McCain enjoyed a story I frequently told about when I first got here. You know, you recall, Kelly, we do almost everything, not everything, but a lot of things on a seniority basis, including the location of our desk on the Senate floor.
Right.
When I first got here, I had the very last desk all the way over in the corner. The last.
I shared that, actually. I was Senator 102. It's an honor.
I remember the first time we were all sitting where we were supposed to, which of course didn't happen very often, but every once in a while, we all were supposed to sit where we were supposed to sit. I remember looking around the room and thinking to myself, none of these people are ever going to die, retire, or be defeated. But I did notice that Bob Dole had the best seat on the Republican side. And I thought maybe someday, if I was able to get myself reelected and gather some influence from my colleagues, maybe I'd be able to get in that desk. And so that was the desk I had hoped to occupy. And now, amazingly enough, I'm now the longest serving Republican Senate leader in American history. So I dreamed a little bit smaller than most of the other members of the Senate, but was able to achieve what I had hoped to achieve.
Yeah, well, I would say, you know, leading the Senate is a very important job. One thing I don't think people appreciate about that job is, you know, the importance of setting an agenda. What is it, when you've served as leader, has been the most important thing to you as you think about the leaders' principles of leadership that you like to lean on, because you have been the longest serving leader and you've had to navigate through some very difficult issues?
Well, look, I think it's probably similar to leadership positions in the corporate world or as a university president. You need to be a good listener, because people are not going to follow your lead simply because you dictate or act like you're an autocrat. So I think the first principle of being a good leader is to listen to people you're trying to lead. And then second, I learned early in my life, even before I came to the Senate, from a highly successful business leader, that the most important word in the English language was focus. To be able to separate, if you will, the wheat from the chaff, the things that are really important, and to pursue them relentlessly. So the advantage the majority leader has is he or she does get to set the agenda. Doesn't guarantee the outcome, but at least allows you to pick a path you want to try to take the Senate down. And the word focus is important because you're confronted with all kinds of options. I mean, everybody's got an idea to do this, that, or the other, pulling on your sleeve, saying, how about this bill or that bill? So unless you have focus, you can't decide what's the most important thing to pursue. And so I think a combination of listening and then focusing is the key to being an effective leader. And I expect those principles will apply equally in the business world or trying to run a university as well.
Yeah, I would agree, because you only have limited time. And we know that with the same thing with the Senate agenda. So being able to prioritize is really important, and then also marshal people around your cause. You know, that brings me, I think, to one of the leadership principles in your book, and that is, you can start too late, but never too soon. I understand that you learned that lesson the hard way. Could you share that story with us and how that led you to that principle?
Yeah, well, really young in my life, I decided I wanted to run for the state legislature, and I stupidly didn't look carefully at the residence requirements, which required me to be in a district a year before the election. And so I ended up being sued and removed from the ballot. A good example of not planning early and and focusing. So every other race I ever made, and so far, fortunately, I won them all. I never started late, and I always practiced the maximum of a former Democratic governor in Kentucky who always said you can start too late, but never too soon.
I love that. And that never happened again. And I'm sure you've told many new candidates that story in terms of making sure the basics are taken care of.
Yeah, and if you're an unknown candidate when you started, and you were not totally unknown, you were the Attorney General of New Hampshire, but you probably didn't have as much of a name recognition as some of the statewide officials. I always think in a campaign, there are only so many days between now and the election.
Right.
And if you're not doing something useful every single day, that's a day wasted you're never going to get back, which is another good argument, I think, in a campaign context for not waiting till the last minute. Of course, if you've got a ton of money and you're a celebrity, you can probably get away with filing on the deadline. But for most of us normal people,
right,
better to start early rather than late.
Well, exactly. I think people forget you didn't start out that people knew who you are. So having to build that does take some time. And, one of the things that I always appreciated about you, and then even watching from afar now, is that people describe you, and I think it's fair to say you're a man of few words. And when the press, and there's a press conference or they're trying to engage you, they're looking for that juicy soundbite. They generally don't get that from you. So I know you have to decide when you want to engage, and how do you make that decision on when you're actually going to go out in the public arena and make your words matter?
Actually, contrary to what people may think, I'm perfectly willing to talk. The question is it to my advantage to talk? And I think that depends on the issue. One maxim I've tried to employ is you can never get in trouble for things you do not say. And so if you're in my line of work, particularly now that I'm leader, I'm getting peppered with all kinds of questions on all kinds of things all the time.
Right. And for the benefit of those that haven't walked the Senate halls, everywhere you go, there's a reporter saying, well, what do you think about this? And it could be almost any issue you can think of.
Yeah. So typically I just smile sweetly and walk on by. And even if I'm in a press conference situation, if it's a question I don't want to answer, I simply don't answer it. And one of the things that reporters like to do is they'll ask you the same question a slightly different way. Okay. Because they've been taught in journalism school that sooner or later the politician will answer because they'll become embarrassed that they're stiffing you and not answering the question. In my experience, if you give the very same answer 2 or 3 times, that ends it, no matter how they recast the question. So I think the fundamental point I'm making here is just standing around out in the hall and rambling about first things, a whole lot of things that are being brought to your attention is probably not a good strategy for anybody. And particularly is it not smart for somebody who's in a position like I am in the Senate. So yeah, I'm a man of few words, but on purpose. It's not because I'm afraid to talk. I choose not to.
I think as someone who's run for office, I think we have to learn that lesson, and some of us learn it the harder way. So I can appreciate your cutting through that, and I'm sure it took you a few years to learn that as well.
Well, in our line of work and the line of work you used to be in, their goal is to trip you up. It's an adversarial relationship, not just with your opponent in a campaign, but with the reporters. I mean, they get paid to trip you up. And it takes a lot of discipline. And for some of our colleagues, it's kind of something they learned the hard way, or if they never learned, keep getting themselves in trouble by thinking that somehow they can't refuse to answer the question. It's easy to not answer the question, just don't do it.
I think people will be listening to those words of advice quite closely. One of the things I had the privilege of visiting probably 6 or 7 years ago, you had invited me to speak at the McConnell Center at the University of Louisville. And I know that center, you had me speak to some students there about leadership. Can you tell us why you founded that center and how that center helps Kentucky, but also to promote principles of leadership and service?
Yeah, thank you. By the way, our late colleague, John McCain, also came to the McConnell Center at U of L. I set it up now some 30 years ago. It's basically an undergraduate scholarship program for the best and brightest kids from my own state who we could entice to come there. The size was 40, because I thought that was manageable. So in any given year, you'd have 10 freshmen, 10 sophomores, 10 juniors, and 10 seniors. What I did, in addition to initially raising the money for the program for the university endowment, is to bring in speakers like yourself, Kelly, and like John McCain. And the program was always the same. A private 1-hour meeting with the 40 scholars with a Q&A, and then a public address. So over the years, I've been fortunate enough to have, just to give you some examples, virtually every Secretary of State, including people like Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden was there when he was vice president, Chief Justice Roberts. So these kids didn't have to go to Harvard to have an opportunity to interact with some of the great leaders in our country. We've now got about 250 or so graduates. And the hope I had, Kelly, was that if they went to college in Kentucky, they'd end up living in Kentucky. And about 60% of them still live there. They may go off to graduate school and come back. But the goal was to deal with the brain drain that we have in my state and probably many other states. The sharpest kids go off to the Ivy League schools and never come back because they consider whatever our home state was a little too slow, not quite exciting. So that was the goal, and I'm pretty happy with the results. I think it's produced what we had hoped for.
Well, that's terrific. It'll be interesting to see down the line as you look back at the legacy. How many of those students actually go into public service? I bet you that there will be quite a few from the experience.
That's a good question. Not everybody wants to run for office, but interestingly enough, there are 2 McConnell scholars in public office in Kentucky right now.
Wow.
The Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, and the Secretary of State, Mike Adams, were both McConnell scholars at U of L. Now, most of the kids are going to medical school or business or other things, but some of them actually want to run for office. And ironically, as you asked the question, 2 of them are in office right now.
That's a pretty good record to have an Attorney General and Secretary of State, but also just to contribute to the community and to the state, to have professionals that have had that experience and that connection with Kentucky. What a great legacy to have. And I know that Secretary Chow also has been involved with the Institute as well.
She is, and we have an archives there. It's the joint archives, the McConnell-Chow archives, because Elaine has now served for 12 years in a president's cabinet, 8 years under President Bush in the previous administration as Secretary of Transportation. So her papers are there as well. And so in a sense, we're both involved in it. And she's, I think, been an inspiration to a lot of the young women who come through the program, who are also doing great things all around the state.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I have to ask you about a couple of current issues. And the reason I want to ask you about them is because they're issues that if our late friend Senator John McCain were with us, he'd be all over it. So the first one is that I know the president recently made the announcement that he was going to withdraw all troops from Afghanistan by September 11th. And I believe you issued a statement on that. I also had the privilege of co-chairing a commission at the Institute of Peace on this question with former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joe Dunford. And our recommendation was a little bit different than what the president did, as you can imagine. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on this withdrawal and where we stand after our long commitment in Afghanistan.
Well, our friend John McCain used to remind people the war on terror doesn't end when we give up. And I think it's a very unfortunate decision. If you look at where we are today in Afghanistan, we have a very small complement of troops there for counterterrorism purposes and for ongoing training of the Afghan National Army. I'm pretty confident it's the case that we haven't lost a single military personnel in combat in over a year in Afghanistan. So it's not like we're not actively involved in fighting the Taliban. The Afghan National Army is doing that. So what I fear, and I expect you do as well, and I know John would have been apoplectic over this decision, is that by the end of the year, the Taliban will be back in charge of Afghanistan. In addition to our presence, our European allies have been good partners. They've had troops there as well. So with us,
in fact, leader, right now, there are twice as many NATO troops, allied troops, as U.S. troops. So they've stayed with that commitment.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so they'll leave now too, because they're not going to stay without us. So the president will get a short-term headline that everyone will like. We're finally out of Afghanistan after all these years. It's typically called the longest war in American history. That presumes we were in constant conflict for 21 years. We haven't been. We've had a deployment overseas. Various times it's been more challenging, for example, than deployment in Germany or Japan or South Korea. But recently, it's been pretty benign. In other words, we haven't been doing the fighting, they have. And I think the war on terror doesn't end simply because we give up, you know?
I think we wish it would, but that's not the case. And obviously the concern I know that our friend John McCain always shared, and you do as well, is that the reason we've kept Al-Qaeda, ISIS, other groups at bay there is because we've helped put the pressure on them now with the Afghan forces. And so that's really the danger also of the Taliban coming back to ascendancy.
Yeah, well, I think this administration has decided the war on terror is overhyped, is not as big a threat as some think. And so they're going to end it by not confronting it and focusing all of our attention on big power competition, which is important, you know, Russians, the Chinese. But I fear we're sort of setting the predicate here for Afghanistan looking once again like it used to. And the people that are going to suffer the most in the short term are the women in Afghanistan, the youngsters in Afghanistan, when they try to reestablish, you know, medieval restraints against parts of the population that they view as subservient to the men.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear you say that, leader, because we actually, our commission spoke to a lot of the civil society groups in Afghanistan, and they're very worried about that. So it is an important issue. And, you know, I know we only have a couple more minutes, but the other issue that I know you've been passionate about, and I had the privilege of visiting Myanmar with John McCain. You've been passionate about this for decades, about democracy and prosperity. in that country. And with the recent military coup, that's obviously a huge setback. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, because I don't think everyone knows the work that you have done there for decades.
Well, going back to the early 90s, I took an interest in Aung San Suu Kyi, who was the daughter of basically the founder of modern Burma, and who ended up being the leader of an election, after which the military canceled the election and put her under house arrest for the next 21 years.
Right.
We would slip notes back and forth. Finally, amazingly enough, in 2011, they basically let her go out again. They allowed an election, which she and her party won overwhelmingly. Hillary Clinton went out to visit. I did as well. You and John were there shortly thereafter. Yeah. Even though it was kind of a rigged system under which the military had a 25% set aside in the parliament, it's absurd to suggest this. Still, she chose to try to govern. She could have sat on the sideline like Gandhi and just kind of been a symbol, or she could act, she did. And then horrible atrocities occurred against a Muslim majority there called the Rohingyas. And everybody around the world expected her to be able to do something about it. So what you saw then was a pile on all around the world, people taking away her honorary degrees. Somebody wanted to suspend the Congressional Gold Medal that we'd given her here in Washington. She was basically abandoned by the rest of the world because she couldn't produce an outcome that was impossible to produce. I chose to stick with her and blocked efforts to penalize her during this period. And I feel vindicated because they had another election. She won again, and the military has taken over the country again, proving once again that she can't control the military situation there. And I think the obvious answer is the only hope for Burma to become a genuine democracy is to stick with her. She's dealing with an extraordinarily difficult situation. She cannot control the military. And if not her, then who?
Right. So and what a history and the sacrifice that she's made for Burma. There's no doubt.
Yeah, and so I do want to compliment the Biden administration. I do think that they are, at this point on this issue, squeezing what few sanctions levers we have left against this military regime. Secondly, I've encouraged them to take it to the United Nations Security Council, make the Russians and Chinese block. They may, but let's turn it into a bigger issue rather than just a sideline issue that nobody pays any attention to halfway around the world.
Well, thank you for caring about that country. And we have 1 minute left, and I just wanted to say thank you for this conversation about leadership. But I'd be amiss if I didn't end with this event for the McCain Institute, just to ask you, do you have any good John McCain stories that you might end us with? Because, I know from having served a shorter time with John in the Senate that he was quite a force in the Senate.
Well, we all remember his legendary temper. Everybody had a McCain moment, which you blew up and you thought you were never going to have a relationship again and it would blow over. I probably had the longest McCain moment of anyone. We were in a 10-year fight over a campaign finance issue. And in the end, the fight didn't make any difference. In the end, you admired his great life story and the way he conducted himself. And well before the end of his life, we were good friends once again.
I think we all have a story like that, leader. And we really appreciate your having this conversation. for the Sedona Forum today. And thank you so much for your service to our country.
Thanks, Kelly. I enjoyed being with you.
Thanks.